Sharing my screen. Hello and welcome. Thank you all for being here today on this November 4th, 2021. I am Nick Kanoki, the Director of Technology for the Asset Leadership Network, and I am excited for this discussion today about the electric utility. Before we get underway, I just want to thank our patron sponsors, Definitive Logic, Onuma System, ABS Quality Evaluations, and ABS Group. Without the continued support of these organizations, we would not be able to do programs like this in our newsletter. So big thanks to them, as well as our organizational members. As you can see, we have a growing list. And especially the Andrew James Advisory Group. They are launching an ALN 855K professional certification course that starts December 6th, and there is limited availability. So if you're interested in ISO 55000 professional development, please reach out to the Andrew James Advisory Group, or anyone at the ALN can direct you. And with that, I will just say, if you're out there watching, we would love to hear from you. So please send any questions, comments, or feedback to the chat, or use the Q&A function of the Zoom webinar. So I think Jim Dieter is going to start, ALN CEO. Why don't you take us away?
Hey, thanks, Nick. Really appreciate it.
Of course.
Thanks to everybody who's joined us today. Thanks especially to our panelists for sharing their time with us today. As we have been focusing on in our fall event is roundtable discussions is a really good format of hearing what people have to share and what ideas can come out of bringing some different groups of people around specific topics. And we've had some wildly exciting events, I'd have to say. With this crew, I think we'll be there as well. So let me start with Tony McGrail. It's hard to tell the story of asset management in the United States, ISO 55000 in the United States, the US tag for to TC 251 or the ALN without talking about Tony, because he was a big part of all of those and hosted events for the US tag, hosted the early events, as the ALN got started, and was a speaker at our first conference and subsequent ones as well, I believe. So welcome, Tony. It's good to have you here with us today. From where?
South Coast, UK.
You went back for a visit and you couldn't leave, and now you're stuck there. Is that right?
Yeah, pretty much, yeah. That's got to do what you got to do.
Oh, that's great. So often we start these with some words about how you got involved in asset management, but we don't have time for the long stories today. But maybe you give us a brief version of that, Tony. How did you get in? How did you start hearing about asset management and realize its implications for the electric power industry?
Started in the UK in the late 1990s. I was a technical specialist with National Grid in the UK. And more I could see that decisions were being made based on technical information, but by people who had less than superlative technical knowledge. And I realized there was a translation between the technical and financial. It took a while, but eventually I realized that was the asset management process. So I wanted to make sure that as decisions were made, I was giving the best information in a format that would be acceptable. When I moved on some years later to National Grid in the US, independently of the UK, I was actually hired to be an asset manager. And then I had a lot of leeway in terms of what that meant. But I was also given a lot of support in terms of making sure that we had adequate relationships between the technical data and the budget. 'Cause ultimately, asset management is all about the money. Same way football is all about the ball. It's what you do with it that counts.
Football's about the money too,
What I can tell, yeah, let's not go there.
right? That's great. Well, would you like perhaps to introduce Alan?
I will do my best. Alan is a scion of the industry. He is well known around North America. He's well known around the world. His work for over many years in a number of different aspects in the industry, from the technical side, from the analysis and detailed analysis of oil, through to producing journals and magazines, whipping us peons into shape to make sure we can provide articles for publication. He is well known, he's well liked, well respected, and extremely knowledgeable, though he will deny it. And he's gone from, in my humble opinion, from being an acquaintance to being a friend, and I much appreciate his presence, his advice and his guidance. So, Alan,
Thank you, Tony.
glad you're here.
Thank you. I got started in this industry actually by accident. I had my own company. It was a paint company in Wichita, and I was asked to work on a project, believe it or not, on painting transformers, creating paint for transformers. And I got to meet some people, and before long, we sold our company, and I had no insurance and not enough money to retire, but a great desire to learn and to grow. It's one of those things where you sell the company, but you basically pay off all the creditors, get your employees jobs, sell the building, sell the assets, and go, well, I'll be damned. There's not a lot left over for me. But got involved with a company called SD Myers years ago as an advisor. And it moved from there to a passion for asset management. And really, I got heavy into asset management. If you look at Mark's picture there, you see the IAM. I was born in Edinburgh, Scotland, and the IAM had a conference in Edinburgh, Scotland about 5 or 6 years ago. And so I decided I needed to speak at that conference so I could go home and see my parents. And I did, and got it connected to the IAM at that point, got me involved in asset management. Today, I think the most important thing that I get involved in is IEEE Smart Grid. So I am a member of the Smart Grid Committee, the steering committee and program, and the new Grid Edge meeting that IEEE will be putting on in 2023. The organization I lead, EPRA, is we have a Grid Edge working group. Dan Smith from Austin Energy heads that working group up. And as Tony said, I am an editor of a magazine that started off as transformer technology. So we get heavily into the asset called transformers in the electrical system. We like to think it's the heart of the system. And we go from there now into power system technology. So I'm a mechanical engineer. I don't think electrical. I think about systems. And I think all reliability begins at design. And when you're managing assets, are you managing individual assets or the assets as part of a system? And that's kind of now a push and a passion. And that's a lot to say. There's a lot going on in this space.
So you mentioned smart cities and smart grid, and how do those concepts fit together with asset management? Is that a consideration?
Huge consideration. It's interesting. We had a meeting earlier today, and in that meeting, one of the things that came up is, and I brought it up because I said, so when you look at a smart grid, where does asset reliability, I use that word, asset reliability, fit into the smart grid? And it was really interesting. I don't think people really understand assets in a system. Smart grid is just a system and different components of it. And so when we brought that idea of where, assets, it is really interesting when you start naming the assets in a system. They used to be simple. You could name 27 assets in a basic grid. That's not true today because you got so many assets that are monitoring. You got data. Is data an asset? Well, absolutely. It's probably one of our most valuable assets. And I think the role of asset management within smart grid or smart cities, especially smart cities, is expanding dramatically. But I don't think people really necessarily think they're looking at it from an asset perspective. I think Tony will agree with me. We tend to get very technical when we start thinking about a smart grid or a smart city. We don't break it down into its subcomponents. And I think we need to understand the value of assets. But yeah, good question, Jim. That's one of the things we're pushing on at the Grid Edge conference that we do, is to really understand the grid edge from what are the new assets we're bringing in. I mean, we used to use wind farms years ago. The Dutch called them windmills, right? We use them now in a different way. It's a different asset than we've typically used in a smart grid, and we're having to learn how to adapt to the new assets. So I think it's going to become more important.
All right, so we have an acronym or undefined term rule in our conference, and I'm not sure I know what grid edge means. So could you tell us, is that an acronym or a terminology, or what is it?
It's the edge of the grid. No, it really is. When you think about what we do, what we think about in terms of grid is generation. We all know what generation is. You know, it's coal, it's hydro, it's nuclear, etc. And then gas generation. So we create these large generating facilities, and then we transmit that through transmission lines all over the country, and then we distribute it all over the cities. And so we all know what that is: transmission and distribution and generation. The grid edge is what happens at the distribution level, and now what happens at the new generation level, because wind farms are grid edge, solar farms are grid edge. So consequently, this whole step down large generation to transmission to distribution system has turned into a literally distribute everywhere. I mean, it's not a step down, it's a step everywhere. And it's going to happen more and more. Microgrids are grid edge. I like to think, and we're pushing a concept that all of these municipalities, co-ops and municipalities, they're grid edge. They're not as reliable as the generation, transmission, distribution network. And many of them are going off grid. And what happens when somebody goes off grid? They're still the grid edge. You know, when the wind doesn't blow and they're relying on the wind, who do they call upon? They call upon the distribution network, right? So grid edge is all of those things other than generation. Let me take that back. Old style generation, transmission, and distribution systems. It's all of that other stuff, which is now kind of like there's a great model that Dan Smith uses that puts a car in the middle. Transportation, it's a battery. All it is a big capacitance. It's sitting in the middle, and now everything is built around it. And as the battery moves, you know, the grid edge is moving. It's an interesting concept, kind of a neat, as he does it, it gets people thinking and scratching their heads, saying everything we've had has been stuck in the ground, and now you're telling us that our grid edge is moving around. But anyway.
Yeah, so I can bring it to the micro level and say, I'm the poster child for that. We have an electric car, we have solar panels on our roof, geothermal heating in our house.
You're the grid edge.
And, you know, and looking at buying another electric car to replace my nice used Lexus that I have. But, you know, how do you make those decisions from the edge of, you know, what really makes sense? Does it make sense to, you know, does new stuff make sense more than enough sense to get rid of the carbon producing, or, you know, so that's kind of a micro question and a macro question.
Yeah.
Tony, you want to try that?
They get very quickly into net zero and where we need to be in the future to make sure we still have a planet in 100 years' time. The asset management decision is about the value, and these days, not just the cost, risk, performance, but also the sustainability. So when it comes to, for example, a car, and you're looking to get rid of an older car, then there isn't a formal carbon budget approach that you can use. It's going to be a little bit more informal as to what you'll be using it for, how much was invested in the production of the original car. So it's like doing a financial budget, but with carbon. It's not an easy thing to do. So knowing your background, Jim, why are you driving a Lexus anyway? I thought you were into more expensive and bigger cars than that. Much as that's the particular one.
I got a great deal from a good friend, that's why.
There you go. But the bigger decision is about going from fossil fuels. I mean, when you think about it, driving a car around on the basis of a series of small controlled explosions, which is what we've done for the last 100 and something years, isn't necessarily either the safest or the most sensible thing to do. So moving away from those small explosions to energy which is created efficiently, energy which can be renewed, that seems an awful lot more sensible to a lot of people. So I think that's the bigger decision. And if you're already in an electric Lexus, then you're heading in the right direction.
Yeah, so where we
Can I
sit,
bring a point up about what
yeah,
Tony
sure, yeah.
said? And it kind of fits there. You know, Henry Ford was, and if you read a biography of him, he was one of my favorite industrialists. If you read his biography that his daughter wrote, the idea for the mass market or the mass manufactured car, he was standing up on a platform looking down at the people making his cars. And he had the thought, I wish I could make a car that the people making the cars could buy. And the assembly line was created, right? He could make a car that the people making cars could buy. That was important. But he had a dilemma. His biggest competition was probably the Stanley steamer. But what did you need to run a Stanley steamer? You needed wood and you needed water. And you could find wood and water everywhere. What did you need to run a car? You need gasoline. So he made a deal with Rockefeller, Standard Oil, and said, look, I'll build these things to drive everywhere, but you got to put gasoline everywhere. And the whole refining industry and the gasoline stations and the controlled explosions that Tony just referred to happened. Well, that was a dilemma. If he didn't have gasoline, you couldn't have. Our dilemma today is charging stations. And we need them far more rapidly, and we need them to be better and faster because we don't want to wait. You know, we want to pull in, we want to plug in, and we want to be gone in 10 minutes with our bag of chips and our Coke. And so consequently, we don't have a national network of charging stations. And when you start using electrification of transportation, meaning big trucks, meaning buses, meaning a lot of things beyond the car, you're going to need a completely different charging infrastructure that is part of the bill that sits in Congress right now to be able to create. And there will be a lot of money spent, and there will be a lot of money made, and there'll probably be too many mistakes made. But it changes the whole asset structure of the grid. And so that's what would mean grid edge is one of those charging stations.
One of the things you can think about in that, Alan, is I pull in, I get my chips, I get my Coke, someone swapped the battery, and I now drive on because the battery to me is just something under the hood or whatever else. I don't need to worry about it. As long as I've got a battery which I can rely on, just put a new one in, swap it out, and we'll go off and do whatever we have to do. And they charge the other one up while I've gone. So just a different way.
Yeah, we thought about, Tony, I'd like your perspective, because we think we're going to go into net zero, but can you imagine when we start trying to recycle trillions of batteries and what's in the battery and the environmental damage of whatever we create about the battery? I'm not sure. Maybe people smarter than me have started to look at that. Is there any discussion about the impact on the environment of batteries?
There's a lot about how you extract the materials to put into the batteries to start with. And now as batteries get tired, there's an awful lot about how you extract, once again, those materials so they can be recycled and brought around again. So there's a lot of chemistry work involved. There's a lot of physics involved. And it's not a simple problem, but we can't just throw them away because that would just be making things worse in the future. So they do have to be salvaged. Someone somewhere knows what to do.
Yeah.
I've been at the Savannah River site, and they were, had a big industry around trying to figure out what to do with the nuclear waste. We have a similar thing. Mark, I didn't mention, but the thought is to bring Mark and Dragan here as we go along. Mark, you have any insight on electrification and batteries and what we're going to do with them?
Oh, I mean, obviously what Tony was saying, I mean, the battery swapping challenge is an interesting one. I think there's the technological approaches, but then there's the existing approaches that are barriers, and then there's the kind of legal concerns, what are the quality control around battery swapping and the risks of damaged batteries. I mean, I'm a person who's had various radio controlled planes and cars over the years, and I've seen some of those cars with lithium polymer batteries go up in pretty interesting explosions where the batteries have been damaged. So, I love the idea of a battery swap. I think that's the cleanest and quickest way to do it, and you can optimize the charging of those battery banks offline at the most economical rates. But I think that faces some kind of challenges on the quality control side of that.
Yeah, I've been following battery technology for many years, and it seems it keeps improving, but it never gets close to meeting our expectations and our requirements.
If you step away from the transportation batteries, the biggest problem or the biggest opportunity, let me put it that way, that I think we have for wind and solar is batteries. If we have the capacity to be able to capture wind when it's blowing and sun when it's shining, it changes everything. The Tesla wall is an example of what we need on a much more macro scale, the ability to be able to capture that and reuse it when we want it, because if we do that, that will get us away from the dependence upon these really, when you talk about coal plants, I don't think there's a worse thing you can do to the planet than run a coal plant, right? And when we start getting rid of them, we're going to need a lot of power that's in batteries, and they're going to be the size of they're already the size of 18-wheelers or storage containers stacked on end. They're going to have to be bigger, and we got the same problem about recycling. We got the same problem, and those can't be ones that we swap out. They're going to be fixed stationed, and they're going to, in my opinion, be the center of microgrids. You can have a microgrid and generate from wind or solar only if you can rely on other sources of power. And suddenly you start to look from an asset management standpoint. You start to look at it and you say, I'd like to pass that asset cost on to somebody else, to the grid. I want to pass it on to the utility. You must maintain the generation. You must maintain the transmission, et cetera, et cetera. Once you start moving to that edge of the grid and somebody says, yeah, let's do a microgrid to run a city, for instance. If you wanted to run a small municipality, go to a microgrid. And if you do that, though, suddenly the assets are assets that you got to build and you got to own, and they're not the same assets that we used to use in the old grid.
Yeah, I know. I've run into the maintenance and warranty problems with my solar panels are now 10 years old, and they're out of warranty. So if they go out, it's my problem now. And that's like, oh, I'm not sure about that. Well, Dragan, so what do you're on the power generation side, right?
Hydro-Quebec is a major North American electrical utility. And I think that is the only North American utility having this major research institute. And right now in Quebec, the current trend is a heavy electrification of transportation, but all those problems we discuss are also to be solved here in Quebec. but and also the Hydro-Quebec's research institute, there is quite a division developing batteries, you know. And what is interesting is that given this heavy electrification, not only of transportation, but also the society in whole, we become more dependent on the electricity, and we have to keep our electrical power grids reliable and resilient, you know. And Alan, you have spoken about this IEEE initiative about smart grid, but I am the member of another IEEE working group about system of systems, you know,
Yeah.
because we put all that together, we got a complex operational and environmental and business environment, and everything is connected, and the root is the electricity, you know.
Yeah.
And if we lose that, and what it brings new systemic and emergent risks we didn't know before.
Yes.
You know, and my experience in asset management, I am with Hydro-Quebec Research Institute since 2013, but before that, I worked as a reliability and nuclear safety engineer in the nuclear power industry. And the first time I met with this asset management stuff was in the nuclear industry, known as nuclear asset management and risk-informed asset management in the nuclear power industry. So when I started outside the nuclear power industry, I saw that both industries haven't had much contacts, but sound engineering and financial logic has shown that we are not quite far one from others, you know. And it is interesting to put those two words together.
Yeah, thanks, Dragan. So Tony, that so that brings us back to smart grid and smart cities, and you have an IEEE initiative in that direction?
Well, I'd start with just by thinking in terms of the words. We have to understand what the words mean. And if we go back to the origins of the first public networks, Pearl Street in New York in the 1800s, that was a particularly small microgrid. They weren't smart, they were fairly dumb, and the smarts were given by the people who stood around and operated them. So over the years, more and more of the smarts came out of the people. The number of people involved got less and less. And the aim now with the smart grid is to reduce the human element to approximately as close to zero as we can get, trying to remove us completely from the decision-making process. Problem is, there's always something that we haven't seen before. There's always something that we don't know how to deal with. So Dragan makes a very good point on the resilience, emerging problems and emergent problems. The smart grid is only as smart as we make it, and it can only be a reflection of how smart we are. So ultimately, when we get back to the asset level, we need to be thinking in terms of what the assets can do on their own. Get back to Alan and the systems and the systems of systems. And I'm very interested in how the asset management approach is going to support the ability of the grid to respond not only to resiliency requirements, but to end user customer requirements, because they quite often compete.
So you were talking earlier about the asset management and finance and electricity, but it makes what you're just saying makes me think of the smart grid. But how do you keep the politicians? How do you smarten up the politician part of it, and avoid situations like the failures in Texas? Is that part of the smart grid thinking, or is it more micro level?
There's an awful lot of history in that Texas situation, and there's an awful lot of things that could have been done prior and were planned to be done prior that never got done, as far as I know. And there have been a number of IEEE presentations and webinars looking at the system in Texas. I see Dragan jumping up and down, probably wants to throw in some words, and Alan's thinking, I can say a lot about this. From my own experience with that, a lot of what went wrong, as is many times the case with anything that happens on the electric supply system, hindsight is a huge benefit. And we'll be fighting the last war as we come up to the next one. So we'll be prepared for another Texas with a bit of luck, and then something different will happen. Think of Hurricane Sandy coming up in New York, the amount of trouble that caused. We're now prepared for that, but are we prepared for the other ones that might happen in slightly different ways? So, emergent risks.
So
Dragan was,
you mentioned something, Jim, that I think is very, very critical. We did a panel on the Texas disaster after Texas, and it was great because the experts stayed away from blame. We didn't want to say it was this or that. We didn't try to give easy solutions. We just said, here was the problem, here's why it failed, and here's what we could have done differently. But what happened right in the midst of that? The governor of Texas immediately came on and blamed the Lower Colorado River Authority, the wind and solar. The problem is, it's the wind and solar didn't work. Well, the truth is the wind and solar had problems, yes, but it was working. The problem was gas generation didn't work. And the problem was the fact that the whole system based on the ERCOT and it was all financially based didn't work. But when the politicians got involved, it changes everything. And that is the thing. I don't think we have, and I mean this is in the United States, I don't think we have the political will to be able to really solve the problem at present. And I don't think this Build Back Better bill is going to be that much better, but the political will to solve the problems is really something that we've got to get involved in, and we've got to make sure that we put pressure on them to say, you know what, there is a better way to do this. I mean, if I just put Tony or Dragan in charge of the entire grid and said, you can make every decision, they would create a great system. I know they would. But you know what happens? Neither one of them can. Dragan's got the politics of Canada and Quebec, and Tony's got the politics in the United States of 50 states, and each one of them with their own. So I think the political will is an important part of creating a stable, reliable, resilient network.
I think that some stuff could be learned from the nuclear power industry, you know. Back in 1986 with this Chernobyl accident, you know, where political dimension was heavily involved in contributing to this accident. And the whole nuclear power industry has learned the lessons and made some shields in terms of fundamental safety principles, defense and that, and so on, human performance stuff. So we perhaps could have some kind of shielding from the regulatory space of the, I don't know, we have NERC, we have FERC, we have a different regulatory organization that could minimize, not eliminate this non-technical or influence, you know, which could be sometimes very catastrophic, you know, lead to events like we said we can't avoid the disasters, you know. We don't control those external risks, but asset management and the resilience management could provide some kind of solid framework to make sure that we did everything we are able to.
And that's a really good point, Dragan. And I was just that's where I was gonna go to Mark and see if you had thoughts to share on applying asset management to this level of considerations.
Well, I mean, there's a lot of history to the evolution of the industry. I mean, Tony was talking about the early Edison systems, but I mean, the whole regulation system that we have comes back to the whole, you know, the topic of utilities being natural monopolies. So, I mean, that's a whole another rabbit hole we could get down into. But I mean, when Texas happened, there were people saying, well, it could never happen in the Northeast because we have reliability requirements up here. We have to support cold weather. I live in Massachusetts, so, you know, but what, you know, to Alan's point, 70% of the generation in New England comes from gas. That gas comes through 4 gas pipelines. Now, the electric industry has to support, you know, N-1, N-2 contingencies. You know, the system has to be modeled to support failures and you know, manage around those. The gas industry doesn't. So we could quite easily lose gas supply to the Northeast, and then that would bring down the electric system. And the electric system is pretty much core to managing all of the other critical infrastructures. So I think, you know, looking at asset management more holistically has a lot of value. It's, you know, politically it becomes difficult because of the funding systems, who pays for what, and how do you prioritize things. I mean, even within a single utility, it gets really complicated managing the cost, performance, and risk aspects of things. So not sure that really answered your question, but I mean, you take all of those things together, and then you look at what, you know, was being discussed earlier about the changes at the edge of the grid, and possibly, you know, the transition of the grid from power flowing from large generators through transmission and distribution to a lot of distributed generation. And then, you know, there's a lot of factors to consider here that's, you know, very, very complicated.
So let me bring it to what's going on with ISO 55000 for a moment. And we're working on a revision. And one of the topics that I seem to be in the minority on is about the definition of asset as a thing that provides value to an organization. But the current version has a note under that that's saying, really, we're talking about capital assets. Doesn't use those words. But to me, you know, it's the asset, things that provide value to an organization. Example I use is a trucking company. So it's easy to understand the trucks and the warehouse and equipment, but you pull out on the road and go over a bridge and you buy gasoline at a gas station. And, you know, there's lots of assets that you don't control that are critical. And you just, you know, you're not there. And they are certainly assets to a trucking company. It seems a very analogous situation to your edge question, and that the, you know, the assets, a big part of that is the assets that are beyond your control are, you know, are assets to your organization, and any change or interruption to those has a negative impact on your business, and you need to do, you know, exert your stakeholder, excuse me, interest to make sure things happen in the right way. Does that resonate with anybody? Or is that?
I think it points out to what Dragan said and his group within IEEE. We live in a complex world of systems, complex systems that depend on other people's complex system. It's no longer a closed loop, right? Right. That's what the system of systems was all about. And your metaphor is a perfect one. It's, you know, the trucks won't go if they don't have gasoline, but it's somebody else's gasoline until they acquire it. And so much of what we do in asset management is balance sheet management. We allow the balance sheet people to run things because it's on the balance sheet. Well, that gasoline is never on the balance sheet. It's part of an operational budget. Just go and use it. And see, we don't take ownership of operational budgets. We assume that's somebody else doing that, whether that's labor or gasoline or anything like that. And I think that's where we're missing the boat. And one of the things that I would hope, one of the things I like about ISO 55000 is the idea of line of sight, the ability to see from top down to the bottom what's going on. And I really do think it's when you start doing that line of sight that we're going to pick up on these things and go, wait, the asset is useless if it's sitting on the yard. We own the yard, we own the trucks, we own the tires that the trucks are in, but if it doesn't have the gasoline, it won't work. And I think that line of sight thinking is probably, to me, the best thing that comes out of ISO 55000. Mark, I see you shaking your head, so you must agree on that.
I think, yeah. I mean, there's two things for me that are really important. One is, I mean, from an IAM perspective, moving away from 55,000, but you look at the 39 areas that make up the discipline of asset management. The one takeaway I always point out to people is nobody can own all of that. The only place that all reports under is the CEO. So what that tells you is if you want to make asset management work, you've got to collaborate across silos, which takes us back to the definition that's actually in 55,000, right? It's the coordinated activity. So you've got to have that working, but you've got to have those operational day-to-day decisions aligned with the corporate goals with the line of sight, as you said, Alan. And yeah, so you get stuck in your silos, but you also get stuck in your day-to-day decisions, and departments and individuals are often motivated based on personal and lower level incentives, and they often cause actions that get disconnected from the greater good, and that's a real issue.
May I have a little comment there, please, Jim?
Please, sir.
Just thinking in terms of organizations, and organizations are made up of individuals. There's a rule I learned many years ago which relates to this whole line of sight. And I think Mark just very neatly identified the line of sight going down. You have to see all the way, but you don't necessarily see all the way when you look up. What was the guy, the janitor, who said when he was asked by JFK, what are you doing? Helping put a man on the moon. That was his job at NASA. So he's got a position, he's got a place. There's another way of looking at organizations, well, several ways, but one of them is that in any organization of any reasonable size, a third of the organization are trying to do something. 2/3 are trying to stop them. And it may sound facetious, but for the best will in the world, people are stopping things happening, not necessarily for safety reasons or for financial reasons, but because it's their job at an interface between elements of the organization, and they don't want things to come in, and they've got the power to stop it. So it's a very cynical view, but it seems to work. It seems to apply. I've applied it in 3 or 4 different countries and 3 or 4 different continents. And so as long as people are involved, communication is going to be an issue.
One of our
I'd like to find those other 2/3 of the people, Tony. Those are the people that are blocking us, right?
You have to be careful because quite often that 2/3, they get medals for devotion to duty because they're really trying to do what they're supposed to do. Right. But they don't get out of the way when they following the whole set of rules that you've got no longer applies.
Right.
So
there's
medal. Move over there.
There's an interesting connection there, and a gentleman that was formerly on our board of directors was named Michael Lipsky, and he wrote a book called Street Level Bureaucracy many years ago, and then did a revision, still used in graduate schools. But the idea, the basic premise is, if I could reduce his book to a few sentences, apologies to Michael, is you can write all the policy you want, but the thing that matters most is the person delivering it. Are they going to do it or not do it? How are they going to make decisions?
It's quite often the electric supply industry tends to be quite inertial because historically, if things went wrong, people got hurt and people died for safety reasons, if nothing else. When storms come through, then people lose power. There are big consequences. So it's been very risk averse and very inertial. Yeah. More and more now, the leadership is risk prone. Risk appetite is quite high. So we have to be thinking in terms of the risk that they're looking at may not be the same as the risk which we've seen before. And that's back to Dragan's point of emergent changing and emergent issues, the resiliency of the system. And remember now, the system might be my local microgrid, because I don't see beyond that. I just see the hole in the wall where the electricity comes out. If it doesn't, I need to find someone to blame.
So I have a good one-liner I'd like to share, but to the previous, well, to Tony's point, to what Alan was saying, I mean, and to your point, Jim, one of the areas in asset management is management of change, which is in all of the management standards, but that's proactive addressing of technical risk. One of the things that's not in there at all is change management. And one of my colleagues who is a big change management proponent once said to me, value comes from what gets used, not from what gets built. So if you don't get those 2/3 or at least some of them, you know, jumping into the camp with the other third, it doesn't matter what systems we put in place. It doesn't matter what asset management processes we put in place. If people don't use them and use them the way they're supposed to be, we're going to leave a lot of value on the table. So, and to Tony's point, I mean, culture is hard to change. Culture in utilities is almost impossible to change. But there have been very good reasons why that's the case, because it's critical and it's very dangerous.
And with I told that before. Those are soft issues, hard to solve.
That's a great line. Love it.
So because
I'm writing it down.
yeah, from the engineering side, we build models, equation, we understand the physics of degradation, everything. But those soft issues, human and organizational performance, it is quite difficult. Assets, physical assets, we could control very well through maintenance programs, inspections, through replacement and so on. Organization, we can't control. We could influence at various degrees, but it is not a machine. People are not machines. So it is another set of skills to be employed, and it is all the part of asset management. So, and the third thing is that I said that before, that outside of organization, market, natural environment, and so on, we don't control that, but we are heavily exposed to this environment, and we are hit with consequences with those risks.
So one of our other themes for our events this fall is equity, and we've had some really awesome presentations on it. And as we're talking about the soft issues that impact the hard issues. How does equity play into this picture with asset management and smart grid and smart cities, and how does that play? Asset management have a role to play?
Don't know, jump at once.
I mean, I think it plays as an important part in this as it does in anything else. I mean, I know one of the frustrations to me in running working groups in the past is the people that come in with dogged views that they don't want to change, but you don't always want everybody kind of singing from the same hymn sheet, all agree. You need to be challenged. You need different views. You need different ways of looking at things. Equity and inclusion are both, they provide value and they're good for everybody. I mean, and in fact, the IEM a couple of years ago, a year ago, had 4 hot topics they were looking at, devoting, work in. One of those was inclusion. And they decided to drop that as a hot topic and replace it with asset maturity, because inclusion isn't a hot topic. It's something that's fundamental and part of the way that they operate. It's part of the way we all should be operating. But it's easy to say that. It's not so easy to do it. I think I'm lucky to work with for a company that actually has pretty good inclusion. It's oh wow, I'm kind of drying up here with my thought, I think.
So where you were heading with that thought, Jim, was inclusion, diversity, etc. That was a question for you, Jim.
I'm sorry, say again, please.
Was that where you were heading with the idea of equity? Was the inclusion, the diversity, and so on? Or were you thinking more in terms of financial equity?
Now, as personal, more the personal side. But, you know, finances are a part of everything, of course, too. But
Mhm.
I was just going to mention there was a story in the paper, in the Washington Post today, that DC Water is going to start cracking down on people not paying their water bills because they can't continue delivering a service without getting paid for it. Are there similar issues, you know, especially in the pandemic times, in electricity, or are we too much in the middle that we're not connected to that individual user at that level?
You know, water is life, right, Jim? And you can say, hey, everybody has access to water. It's more of a right than it is a, you know, a privilege, because water is life. Well, Dragan said this, I think Tony mentioned it. Electricity is becoming life. We can't live. It warms our homes. It's how we travel. And so consequently it is. And with that, you get a lot of people who, from the simple, I can't pay my electrical bill, and you get moratoriums and groups coming in. But I think if you took the amount of the electricity used at the home level, residential level, and the amount of outstanding debt as a result of it, you'd just be amazed at that. I think in the UK, correct me, Mark and Tony, if I'm wrong, but in the UK, if you don't pay your bill long enough, they'll put you on a program where you have to buy your power in advance. You know, you got to. You know, I do remember my family. They had to put coins in a slot. I was in Edinburgh, and my grandmother used to have to put coins in a slot to get power. And when she ran out of coins, she ran out of power. Then it became a right, and the power companies couldn't cut it off until you had third warning, fourth warning. But the pandemic has created the discussion around, is electricity life? Should we make sure that every house, every home, every child has access to electricity? You can't have this conversation. We can't have internet. We can't have discussions through our phone systems. They'll only last so long, right? Unless we have power. And so consequently, I think it is fast becoming more of seen as a right, not a privilege. Used to be a privilege. And I think that's going to change how we manage the assets that provide that right.
Interesting. Mike or Nick, I see there's a lot of things going on in the chat. Are there any questions in there that you'd like to bring to our attention?
Well, I think I saw a very interesting question, Jim, which was about the use of artificial intelligence.
Yeah.
And how artificial intelligence needs to be diverse in its perspective and consideration of the end users. Otherwise, the artificial intelligence will be too focused. And so what efforts are being taken to make sure the smart grid is being designed to be flexible? And it's an interesting question because the role of artificial intelligence is growing. Well, what's being learned, and I will put my opinion out, is that use of artificial intelligence has to be really, really focused, small pieces. And then you have to bring back Alan's system of systems and bring them together so that you can have a piece which is reliable to do a certain job over and over and over. And then you can put that into a high level of intelligence or a more complicated system. And so we can't address everything. And it's going to be a case of the artificial intelligence is going to be artificial as far as we can see into the future. There isn't going to be a singularity in the near future where they take over.
Singularity, yeah.
We
So
hope.
Jim, the chat has been mostly reaffirming what people have been saying.
Okay.
So good to all the panelists. You're making statements that people are liking. But I do have a question, and it is, what can we do with our various organizations? How can we all come together and maybe assert some pressure in the US on political will to think in a more holistic way, or think in whatever way is necessary?
First of all, I think we have to work out what the message is and what we're trying to achieve. So we've got to move away from the soft targets to specifics, and getting to specifics about smart grids, about assets which people really don't understand for the most part, about the provision of electricity as a right rather than a privilege. Working out those ideals is going to be complicated, but without them, then we'll just be always fighting an uphill battle and never get there.
I think, Mike, it's doing things like this where different organizations are represented. And I think that's something that ALN can certainly bring about, that we bring people together. There's only two reasons people act: out of selfish, vested selfish interest. You know, it's in my best interest to act, or there's a bear that's going to eat me if I do something out of fear, right? We have a bear. We have bears we have tornadoes and frozen tundra areas. I think Quebec's the only safe place. It's cold, but you're not going to be, because global warming, you're going to get warmer. You know, but you don't have hurricanes, you don't have forest fires, you don't have the things that we're really struggling with. Even in the Northeast, they've had some really bad weather. So consequently, I think it's got to be, we've got to rally around the solution and not just try to always run from the problem. And I think, as Tony just said, we've got to have a great value prop, and we got to message it correctly. And each of us has to say, what value do we bring, but what value will we accept from other organizations? Our organizations, almost any organization I'm part of, is very self-centered and selfish. And what we got to do is, the system of systems is break it apart and say, we are better together, far better together. And I think it comes from communication, and not just having our own vision and charter, and this is what's best for us. We got to look at it and say, how do we work with other people and maybe make both of us more valuable? It's the message of synergy. And I think it applies to organizations as much as it applies to nature.
It is true, I agree, but it is the very basic of human nature, you know. We are selfish, and also the human nature is that we don't like necessarily to systematically prevent things, but we like heroes who save the world after the event, you know. So we could bring the message that we'll advocate for heroes before the event, you know, but it is hard to work that in the current human nature, but you know, we should never stop doing that.
Prevention is better than cure.
We have a funny story in the maintenance world, right? The maintenance or reliability world for electrical systems. Maintenance Mike is the hero. When anything breaks, he gets in there and he can fix it. But the guy that keeps it running so that it never breaks is never considered a hero.
Yeah.
Yeah. You know, when, you know, and some really good words and ideas here, you know, and I've used us in the ALN. You know, you think about just how many assets there are and how important it is to everything that we do. When we were, you know, we've been pitching our national asset leadership strategy on Capitol Hill, and now we have sector asset leadership strategy, which could be a mechanism involved in this discussion. If people want to get involved in that, a worthy discussion just there. But the amazing thing that we realized when we went to talk to, you know, staffers on Capitol Hill was most people come and say, there's a problem, do something about it. We were coming and saying, there's a problem you are not fully aware of, and we have the solution. And that's powerful. And we should be able to sell it. And I always feel somewhat incompetent when people don't get it, you know, that this is, it really is a path to the solutions. It's not necessarily the solution, but it's that decision. Yeah, asset management provides that structure and decision framework and approach that allows you to decide what's going to be a political decision and what isn't going to be a political decision, et cetera. Perhaps we could, Mike, perhaps we could convince these folks to get involved in our ALN electrical power industry board and work on a strategic asset leadership strategy for this sector.
You will all be receiving an email inviting you to a discussion on how to look at our national asset leadership strategy, and from that, develop an electric utility sector asset leadership strategy.
That's a lot of words. I was tripping over it myself.
Yeah.
Yeah, the best way to do that, Mike, is put everybody on camera and ask them for a commitment. Oh, right.
I'm not even asking you for a commitment. Based on everything each one of you have said, I am convinced that you are interested in this, and I'm just assuming that you'll participate.
Well said.
I just wanted to come on, and since we're close to the end of the hour, thank everyone who showed up and participated in the discussion, and also make sure to thank again our patron sponsors, Definitive Logic, Onuma System, ABS Quality Evaluations, and ABS Group, as well as our other organizational members, especially the Andrew James Advisory Group, who is launching a A55K professional certification course. So if anything you heard here today or during the conference has inspired you to look more into a structured asset management like ISO 55000, please reach out to the Andrew James Advisory Group. The limited availability for the course starting December 6th. So do that soon, or reach out to someone at the ALN and we can direct you that way.
But if we can go into overtime, Mark.
Be right back, Mike.
Okay. Mark, did you have any ideas on the how to go forward as a unified group? Mark?
Yeah, can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay,
hear
no, I was just trying to think where the heck to start. I mean, we have IOUs, we have munis, we have co-ops, we have 50 state regulators, we've got federal regulation, we've got 3 interconnects, multiple market systems, and on top of that, the same fundamental challenges facing each of the utilities. And no, so I think the honest answer, Mike, is I think this is one of those things I'll answer better once I've slept on it.
Okay.
I mean, one of the things that, though, I was intrigued by the water example, because I often get drawn into talking about the natural monopoly characteristics of the industry, and how Samuel Insull basically transformed that and created the regulated franchise structure 100 years ago. And one of those 5 characteristics is that the commodity is essential for the community, which as was said in the discussion, it is. So I mean, but the changes at the edge are actually disrupting those natural monopoly characteristics. So there's just so many factors in play here. I'm not sure where I would start.
Well, one of my mentors said, if you're ever stuck on a problem, make the problem bigger. And I think that's one of the things that we can do. And that's what establishing a national asset leadership strategy is. It's an audacious thing to think that the entire nation, the federal government, all the state and local governments, all the companies, would benefit from understanding a asset strategy that's unified. And Tony said it gets complex because of each of the individual components that are involved in it, and that resolving the individual components is what's necessary for the solution. But to first establish a big picture problem statement, how can we improve the use of the assets in the electric utility industry. Oh, if everyone used a structured approach to asset management. So that is a simple statement. And it can have a cascading effect that if all the utilities start using this, that's a possibility for getting to what Tony is saying is a solution on the system level.
One of the things with a structured approach is that there's a carrot and a risk, right? So I had an interesting debate with somebody from the California Public Utilities Commission at Distributech a few years ago about the value of compliance. I mean, compliance is a good tool to raise a large number of organizations to a minimum standard. But if you want to excel, you basically throw compliance to one side and focus on continual improvement and best practice. But with something like ISO 55000 or putting standards out there for utilities to follow, there is a risk that regulators will adopt it, have staff look through it, and then there'll be penalties for utilities that aren't complying with it. And it's always going to be a lot better to have people adopt a policy because they want to and they see benefits in it, rather than beating them with a stick until they do the minimum necessary.
Interesting, because a number of years ago, I gave a small presentation on PAS 55 in New England. And one of the questions from the audience was about assets, because I'd said, first of all, you need to know what you're interested in, what your assets are. Someone has to have a list. And the question was, do I really need a list? Do I have to know what I've got? So we've moved on a little since then. But we still have to have that basic approach of making sure that we know what the assets are. And then the compliance is a set of rules about making sure we, as it were, know what we're doing. And one of the worries I've got is that we're going to do exactly like you said, Mike. We're going to be sacrificing organizational improvement on the altar of compliance and certification. So if I've got a certification piece, then I've got the stripes, I've got the Boy Scout badge, I've got whatever you want to call it, but does that mean I'm any better at what I need to do?
Well, that's the beauty of ISO 55000. I really think of it as a religious document. It's all there. And if you are certified to ISO 55001, then you have to say how you're going to continuously improve. That's got to be part of your response. So it's built into it that you'll have an answer, Tony.
So give an example from the old world of ISO 9000. And this was the guys at Liverpool University in the UK. And if you know guys from Liverpool, you know what they're like. The quote that I got from the head of the engineering department was, if our ISO 9000 quality statement said, we teach poor students badly, they would always meet or exceed the ISO 9000 statement.
Exactly.
So they can be certified to that.
And if your organization is dumb enough to say that, then you have been certified, and we will say you're achieving your mission. And when your organization crashes, we will say you succeeded in what you wanted to do.
So what is the benefit of this certification?
Is anybody going to actually say we teach bad children poorly as their mission statement? I don't think so.
Unlikely, but it was just making the point that no one reads these things anyway, for the most part.
So the thing that I have been so excited about is the people who want to come and tell the audiences about their use of ISO 55000 are enthusiastic and want to share the value that they have gained and are sharing with their competitors what is possible, because they think it's such a wonderful management system to follow. There's nobody has come on and said, I followed ISO 55000 and now I've lost profitability. You know, I'm losing employees. It's been horrible. It was a waste of time. Everyone's saying things like 20 to 30% improvement in productivity, profitability, customer satisfaction, whatever they're mentioning, it's outrageously successful. So yes, there's always going to be people who are saying you can't do it, but we're not coming across those people yet.
It's okay when you get to that point, right? At that point, you've drunk the Kool-Aid. It's forcing, and how do you encourage people to get there? I mean, I won't name the organization, but we visited with a company that was wholly on board with this, and it was just incredible. I mean, we met with the board, the C-level. We were in generating plants with folks in oily jeans and hard hats. We visited numbers of sites, and they all loved the asset management approach. They were totally committed to it. They recorded everything. They captured everything they did accurately. We pulled random numbers off of equipment and said, when was this last maintained? When was it replaced? Why was it replaced? And they had documents for everything. They could explain everything. They understood what they were doing and why they were doing it, and they were seeing huge benefits. It was just wonderful. But that's not what every company's like.
So now we're getting to the heart of the matter. We have had the privilege of having many events at the National Academy of Sciences, and it's really helped the Asset Leadership Network. I wish, though, we could meet at the National Academy of Human Behavioral Sciences, because it's culture and this thing that Alan had said earlier, what's in it for me? What's the selfish return? So again, I think ISO 55000 is a perfect document in this, because it starts off with alignment with organizational objectives. And if you aren't aligned with the mission of your organization, see you later. And most organizations will say that. And I think enforcing people to be aligned with the mission eliminates a lot of the personality issues that can come up in an organization that's not mission focused. The military is an excellent example of mission focused organization. People are prepared to die doing their job because they have bought into the mission. And Tony mentioned that people died in the electric utility industry, and that's why they're needed to have safety and compliance and all these other records. But most organizations, if you get a leader who is able to clearly articulate what the mission is, and your mission needs to be updated on a regular basis. It's just not one mission and that's it. It's got to reflect changing times and things. So that eliminates a lot of the personality issues.
Mike, can I suggest, we don't want to keep people too long. I think we've already lost Dragan, and I didn't get a chance to apologize to him for he had a couple of slides he really wanted to share. We need to find a way to, Dragan's got some really amazing scientific technical stuff. We got to find a way to bring that to light. But maybe it's time to go around the room one time with some final thoughts, and let people live to talk another day. What do you think?
Very good. Thank you for letting me jump in here and have my theological rant.
That's good. Mark, perhaps you'd like to go first?
Sure. It's a shame that Dragan left, actually, because he said something that I loved, his point about the culture of heroes. And if you've ever watched any of John Oliver's rants on HBO, he did one a few years ago on infrastructure in the US.
Yeah.
And part of the segment in that was a new Lego kit that comes pre-built, and your job every day is to check every single brick and make sure it's not loose. And, it comes back to that, the real heroes are the people that prevent failures. And I think part of the National Asset Management Leadership Strategy needs to be actually communicating to people what asset management is. It's not just going out and doing maintenance well. It's a much broader topic than that.
That's good. Alan, perhaps?
Yeah, I think one of our problems is that the robustness of the assets. Most of the transformer, I think the average transformer in the power grid is now 40 years old. They were never, the cars weren't built to go 40 years except for Cuba. But, you know, we overbuilt assets. I was an engineer at Georgia Tech. I used a slide rule. We always guessed to the upside. And I just think we have depended upon this robustness of the assets, whether that be transformers or cables or transmission towers. It's just been an incredible accomplishment, but they are now coming drastically near end of life. It's a cliff. It's not a steady slope. And I think the next generation of assets are built to rating, but not built to the same robustness. And that's a big concern that I think we think we can just replace asset for asset, and it's not going to be the case. And I think the life cycle is shortening. So I'm concerned that that thing that we're all running from, the bear that's going to cause us the problem, is not just a bear. It's a whole bunch of bears, and we need to do something about it.
Well said. And Tony, back where we started.
It's interesting. I'm going to echo what Alan said about the cliff coming up. One, I don't particularly believe in it because I'm a statistician and I do all sorts of clever things. Not so much that, but I've done the analysis. Things that were built a long time ago were built bigger, more robust, stronger. And when I look at the statistics, and here's my statistical analysis tool, by the way. It's very useful. As an aside, I often use this because people know how to deal with populations. We can say what the statistics are. We say what the numbers. I say, okay, I've just rolled it. Tell me what the number is. Statistics go out the window. They don't apply to the individual. They only apply to the population. But on Alan's front, what we found is that if you look at transformers made in the 1950s, they had a certain age that you'd expect. In the 1960s, they have a certain age, 1970s, and so on. And the age is getting smaller at which they are likely to fail. So there's going to be a rush at some point. We're just not sure when that's going to be. And we do need to replace things more quickly. Prevention is better than cure, back to the hero subject. You know, if you can prevent, fine, but you can't prevent everything. And one of the few times that the whole company would come together, one of the companies I work for, would be in an ice storm or a winter storm. Everyone knew what the problems were. Everyone knew what the cause was. Everyone knew what they had to do, coordinate, get it out there, and we would respond and then people get the lights back on. It was re-providing to individuals their basic, as it were, human right. So what we need to do is get back to the assets. We can do all the soft stuff, but ultimately there's a bunch of hard assets out there and they can be ornery beasts. And we've got to make sure we understand them. We know how they work. We apply artificial intelligence if need be, and we use them to benefit.
Well,
No word after benefit, by the way, it's just to benefit.
great. Well, a lot to think about. Probably a lot more we could have talked about. Thanks to all the people in the chat who had comments. A lot of interesting comments were added. Thanks to Mike and Nick, and thanks to you panelists very much for joining us today. And Nick will be doing his magic and making this available, along probably with some edited snippets. I don't know. There's probably too many to get out of this one, but it'll be available for you to use and to share on our YouTube channel. So again, thank you all very much, and to Alan, safe travels, and everybody else. Have a great day, and thank you, and thanks from the ALN.